What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The first time I knew this wedding would end in disaster wasn't when my sister banned me from giving a toast. It was 6 months earlier, standing in the hallway of her overpriced apartment, watching her try on a dress that cost more than my first car, and hearing her casually mention that she hoped someone would cover the rest of the vendor deposits. That someone, of course, being me. She said it with that tone, half joking, half daring me to say no, knowing full well that I wouldn't. That I never did. That I always found a way to make things work, to step in where others stumbled, to be the fallback plan no one thanked, but everyone counted on. And like the idiot I sometimes still am, I nodded, wrote another check, and reminded myself that family comes first. Even when they forget you exist, unless your name's on the invoice. I arrived at the venue the morning of the wedding wearing my navy dress uniform, straight-backed, sharp-edged, with my ribbons neatly pinned and my shoes polished to a mirror shine. I hadn't worn it since Dad's funeral, and part of me hated how tight it felt, like the uniform had somehow grown heavier over the years, or maybe it was just the weight of everything I was dragging behind me that made it hard to breathe. The hotel ballroom was already bustling with people I didn't recognize, Emily's yoga friends, her college sorority sisters, extended relatives I hadn't seen since our grandmother's funeral. Everyone looked expensive. Everyone looked curated. I stood out, and I knew it. But I wasn't here to blend in. Emily barely glanced at me when I walked in. She was surrounded by bridesmaids in blush silk robes, each clutching mimosa glasses and talking over one another about centerpieces and false lashes, and whether the photographer captured their good sides. When she finally did look my way, she narrowed her eyes at the uniform. "Do you really have to wear that?" she asked, only half smiling. I replied evenly, "It's either this or the dress I wore to your graduation, which I also paid for, so take your pick." That shut her up for a beat, though not long enough. A few minutes later, as I stood by the corner table where someone had dumped gift bags and discarded heels, Emily walked up to me with her lipstick half done and her voice dripping sugar and steel. "Listen," she said, not looking me in the eyes, "this is my day. My one day. Please don't make it about you. No speeches. No stories. Just smile and support me. That's all I ask." I studied her for a moment. This woman I used to braid hair for when she was 5. This woman I once carried across a floodplain after her shoes sank in the mud. I nodded. "Sure," I said. "Just smile." She didn't even thank me. It's funny how memory works. In moments of stress, you don't remember the good things. You remember the moments that sting. Like the time I got back from deployment 3 years ago and no one met me at the airport because Emily had a photo shoot for her lifestyle blog. Or the time she told me laughing that my haircut made me look like someone's strict gym teacher. Or the countless times she forgot birthdays, missed calls, sent late texts that started with "sorry, been crazy busy," and ended with requests for money. And I gave. Every time. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I still believed we were sisters. Real sisters. The kind that could grow old side by side and still laugh about old movies and shared secrets. But real sisters don't erase you when it's inconvenient. During the ceremony, I sat in the third row, behind a family friend who barely acknowledged me and in front of an aunt who whispered too loudly about how lovely it all turned out. The music was soft. The lighting was filtered. Emily walked down the aisle in her designer gown looking like a magazine cover. The groom smiled like he'd won the lottery. And for a second, I believed in it, the fairy tale she'd been selling for months. But that illusion cracked the moment the officiant started talking about love and sacrifice, about two people coming together to share everything. I caught myself almost laughing. Share everything? Emily hadn't shared the credit, the gratitude, or the truth. I swallowed it down. Again. By the time we reached the reception, I was running on fumes. My mother had already made 2 passive-aggressive comments about how wonderful it is that Emily pulled this off, and not once mentioned the financial sinkhole I'd willingly stepped into for the past year. There was a carefully printed program at every place setting, listing the evening's events, including speeches by the groom's best friend, the maid of honor, the bride's college roommate. But not me. Not the one who funded the entire operation while living out of a government-issued apartment with a mattress that barely qualified as furniture. I sat down at my assigned table, table 12, toward the back, near the bathrooms, and stared at the monogrammed napkin in my lap. Someone across the table was talking about real estate. Someone else was comparing wedding DJs. I tuned them out. My focus narrowed on the head table, on the perfectly arranged centerpieces, on the champagne flutes catching the light, on the microphone standing just a few feet from Emily's elbow. She caught me looking at it and gave a small shake of her head. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That's when I knew she thought she'd won. She thought she'd silenced me. That all it took to erase my years of sacrifice was a forced smile and a velvet rope of social cues. That all I'd ever be to her was a quiet wallet in uniform. Background noise. But what she didn't know was that every smile I'd ever forced taught me how to wait. And I was done waiting. There's a certain kind of silence that builds in families over time, not the peaceful kind, not the soft kind you get when everyone's at ease with one another, but the brittle, breath-holding kind that settles over rooms like dust, coating everything in a layer of denial so thick that even honesty starts to feel like betrayal. That's the kind of silence I grew up with. It didn't come from screaming or fighting, not really. It came from pretending, from constantly reshaping truth into something more palatable, and from knowing that in our house, the person who kept things running, who held everything together when it should have fallen apart, was expected to do so quietly, gratefully, and without complaint. I learned early that sacrifice wasn't something you were thanked for, it was something you were expected to make, because it was your place in the family. My place, apparently. After Dad died, things didn't crumble all at once. They just shifted. Subtly. Our mother, always more concerned with appearances than substance, retreated into her job and her book club and the illusion of being a strong, composed widow. Emily, who was still in high school at the time, unraveled quietly, ditching school, dating every wrong boy she could find, acting out in ways that screamed for attention even though she claimed she didn't want it. And me? I picked up the slack. I came home early from college, took night shifts to keep the lights on, postponed officer training to help Emily with her SAT prep even when she swore she didn't need it. I sat across from guidance counselors, PTA moms, and financial aid officers, pretending I was her mother, because someone had to show up for her. And through it all, our mother watched from a distance, sipping wine from the good glassware and telling her friends that Jenna was such a responsible young woman, as if that explained everything. Years later, when Emily decided she wanted to go to design school, some overhyped, overpriced institute in Los Angeles that offered little more than Instagram backdrops and debt, I didn't argue. I didn't say, "Can we afford this?" or "What's the plan after?" I just nodded and started the paperwork. I pulled money from my savings, took on extra shifts, skipped vacations, and sent her enough each month to cover not just tuition, but rent, books, and the kind of lifestyle that made her look like she had it all figured out, even when she didn't. And I never once got a thank you that felt real. The only time she acknowledged it publicly was in a half-hearted Instagram story where she wrote, "Couldn't have done it without my support system." A caption over a picture of her friends holding martinis. I wasn't even tagged. I told myself it didn't matter. That maybe this was just how it worked. Maybe older siblings were supposed to fade into the background while the younger ones bloomed. Maybe the reward wasn't acknowledgement, but seeing her succeed. But then came the wedding. The wedding changed everything. From the moment Emily got engaged, it was like the world tilted on its axis. Suddenly, there were planners and florists and tastings and spreadsheets and group chats filled with strangers who had very loud opinions on napkin textures. The budget ballooned within weeks, and while the groom's parents contributed a little, and our mother tossed in just enough to claim she was involved, the bulk of it, the down payments, the deposits, the rush orders all landed on my shoulders. I sent money quietly, the same way I always had, wiring funds from my deployment pay and making do with secondhand gear so she could have hand-stitched table runners flown in from Vermont. She never asked how I was managing it. She never cared. At one point, when I tried to talk to her about scaling things down, maybe choosing a more modest venue or trimming the guest list, She looked at me like I'd suggested canceling the entire thing. "You don't get it," she said, her voice clipped. "This is the only time I'll ever do this. I want it perfect. I deserve it." Deserve. That word stuck in my head like a splinter. I thought of the years I'd spent eating stale chow hall food while she sipped organic coffee in a studio apartment I helped her afford. I thought of the nights I missed birthdays, holidays, friends' weddings, also I could keep funneling cash into her never-ending dream board life. And now, when I gently nudged back on her expectations, I was the villain? The unsupportive sister? The control freak? Still, I kept quiet. I sent the money. I showed up for the dress fittings, the tastings, the planning meetings I had no business being part of, all because she wanted me involved, but only in ways that didn't threaten her spotlight. Every time I offered a practical idea, I was met with an eye roll or a sigh or a flat, condescending, "Jenna, this isn't a military drill." And I bit my tongue. Again and again. I played the part of the loyal, invisible investor. Until I overheard her on the phone with a friend the week before the wedding. She was laughing, God, she was always laughing, and she said, "Yeah, the wedding basically paid for itself. Some private fund came through last minute." Crazy, right? And just like that, my heart cracked. Not because she didn't name me, but because she chose not to. Deliberately. She erased me from the narrative to keep her fairy tale clean. To keep herself the hero. So by the time the wedding day arrived, and she told me, once again, to just smile, not to speak, not to interrupt her perfect story, I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was something else entirely. I was aware. I was awake. I finally saw the truth, not just about her, but about the way I had allowed myself to be used for years, in the name of loyalty, in the name of family, in the name of being the strong one. It hit me like a cold wind. I hadn't just enabled her, I had trained her to expect my silence. And now she expected it again. She assumed, as always, that I would show up, shut up, and write the check. But the fine print had changed. The terms of our unspoken contract were no longer valid. This time, I wasn't going to smile. I was going to speak. And the mic was closer than she thought. There's a certain irony in being the one who holds the ladder steady your whole life, only to realize, too late, that the person climbing it never once looked down to see who was keeping them from falling. That thought kept circling in my mind like a stubborn storm cloud as I sat in the dimly lit rehearsal dinner the night before the wedding, surrounded by a sea of faces beaming with artificial enthusiasm, forks clinking against porcelain, white tablecloths smoothed to perfection, and everyone playing their parts in a story Emily had meticulously scripted for herself, complete with the rustic barn aesthetic, the catered fusion menu that cost more than most people's mortgage payments, and the kind of choreographed champagne toasts that made it feel more like a production than a celebration. I had offered to help with the seating chart weeks earlier, thinking maybe I could at least ensure some distant relatives I actually liked were at my table, or perhaps make sure I wasn't exiled to the back like some awkward extra in a wedding movie. But Emily had brushed me off with a casual, "I've got it covered," followed by a quick subject change and a warning not to overstep. That word echoed in my ears that night, overstep. As if paying for her designer cake, her string quartet, and the hand-calligraphed invitations was somehow just a polite favor, rather than the full-scale financial operation I had conducted quietly and alone. Still, I stayed seated. I smiled when prompted. I nodded through the speeches and smiled through the clinks of raised glasses, though every toast made me feel more like a ghost than a guest. The night dragged on, each interaction chipping away at the last layers of patience I'd been clinging to like armor. An aunt I hadn't seen in over a decade leaned across the table to tell me how stunning Emily looked in all the pictures, then added, almost as an afterthought, "She's so lucky to have had this wedding work out, with everything going on these days." I responded with a polite smile and a sip of wine, biting back the urge to say, "Yes, it's incredible what a few hundred hours of unpaid overtime and a drained savings account can buy you." Another guest, a friend of the groom, asked if I had taken leave just to be here, as though my presence was optional or inconvenient. I nodded again, because what was the point in explaining that I'd requested the time off 6 months in advance, adjusted my deployment calendar, and flown across the country with barely enough time to unpack, just to make sure Emily had one more person in the crowd to clap at the right moments. But the breaking point, the moment I knew something in me had shifted for good, came in the middle of a speech by one of Emily's bridesmaids, a petite blonde woman with a voice like an Instagram reel, all smiles and breathy sincerity, who stood in front of the crowd, clutching a glass of rose and gushing about how Emily was the most selfless, giving, radiant person she had ever met. I looked over at my sister, sitting at the head of the table in her pastel-wrapped dress, her hands folded delicately, her eyes moist with emotion, nodding as if this was the truth, the whole truth. And not just a filtered version of reality she had carefully cultivated over years of selective memory and emotional revision. I watched her smile and accept the praise, not once flinching, not once correcting the record, and something in my chest burned hotter than it had in years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the rewriting of history. It was about being erased so thoroughly from her narrative that even my presence was treated like an afterthought. I didn't need applause or credit or a standing ovation, but to sit in a room full of people who had no idea that the only reason this fairy tale had come to life was because I'd quietly bankrolled the dream, sacrificed milestones of my own, and swallowed more resentment than I cared to admit. It was humiliating in a way that made my stomach twist. After the dinner, I stepped outside into the cool air, needing space, needing silence. The stars above were dim, hidden behind a haze of light pollution and late summer humidity. I was staring blankly at a row of string lights dangling from the awning when a voice behind me said, "Didn't see you on the program tomorrow." I turned to see my cousin Drew, who had flown in from Atlanta, holding a whiskey tumbler and raising an eyebrow like he already knew something was off. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, and said, "Guess they didn't need a toast from the bank." He gave a low whistle, then said, "Seriously? You're not speaking." I shook my head. He stared at me for a moment, then let out a short laugh, more disbelief than amusement. Man, if I dropped that kind of cash, I'd be reading poetry on stage in a spotlight. Hell, I'd be officiating. His words settled into me like wet cement, heavy, undeniable, and real. I hadn't just been pushed to the edge of the narrative. I had been deliberately left out, framed as a bystander in an event I had made possible. And what's worse, I had let it happen. I had made myself small, quiet, in the name of peace, in the name of love, in the name of family. I had believed, foolishly, that the satisfaction of knowing the truth would be enough. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Back inside, I passed by my mother, who was telling someone that Emily had always been such a go-getter, and I could barely keep my face neutral. She looked at me just long enough to offer a quick, distracted smile, and then turned back to her conversation without waiting for a reply. It wasn't surprise that filled me in that moment, it was clarity. This had never just been about Emily. It had been about all of them. All the people who had accepted my sacrifices without ever seeing them as anything more than convenient. All the people who had let me become a fixture in the background, reliable and invisible. And so, as I sat back down at my table, watching the servers clear plates and refill champagne, my eyes returned to the head table and, more specifically, to the microphone sitting idle just inches from my sister's hand. She glanced at it, then at the crowd, then at me. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. She knew I was thinking about it. She always could read me, just enough to predict when I might go off script. That's why she said it then, leaning slightly over the table, her voice low but firm, with that same warning edge she'd used all her life when she wanted to put me back in line. "Jenna, don't. You promised." I looked at her for a long moment, 1,000 unsaid things crawling to the surface, fighting to be spoken. Then I smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile I'd worn all night. Not the tight-lipped grin I'd used to get through awkward conversations and patronizing glances. No, this one was different. This one was sharp, measured, dangerous. Because I had promised not to speak. But I never promised I'd stay silent. The next morning arrived not like a celebration, but like the final scene of a long play I had seen coming from the first act, and even though the air buzzed with excited voices and the scent of fresh peonies, hairspray, and pastry stations, I felt nothing close to joy, only a strange, detached quietness pressing in on my chest like fog. I had woken up in the hotel room I paid for, of course I paid for it, my dress uniform hanging by the closet door like a suit of armor, sharp-lined, pressed, ready for war, even though all I had ever wanted was peace. I moved through the motions of the day the same way I had moved through the motions of every holiday, every graduation, every milestone that wasn't mine, but that I had underwritten with hours of duty shifts, deployment hazard pay, and a tolerance for being forgotten so long as others were celebrated. I had breakfast alone. I took my time with the coffee, watching the sun smear pale gold across the skyline through the high-rise windows, and tried not to think about the schedule Emily had printed out weeks ago, every moment of the day mapped, color-coded, orchestrated to perfection, with everyone playing their parts and no room left for deviations, surprises, or inconvenient truths. The truth, after all, had always been treated like a crack in the glass, something to cover up with frosting or flowers or forced laughter. By noon, I was standing in front of a full-length mirror, pinning my hair into the precise, no-nonsense style regulation demanded, and as I fastened the last button of my jacket, I caught my own reflection and was struck, not by how polished I looked, but by how unrecognizable I had become to the people I had given everything for. My mother used to say I looked too severe in uniform, too intense, too distant. Emily had once joked that I looked like I was ready to command a firing squad, not walk into a celebration. And maybe they were right, maybe I did look severe, but I wasn't about to apologize for being the person who showed up when no one else did. When I arrived at the venue, the ballroom was already humming with activity, and the decor was objectively stunning, every detail chosen to evoke rustic elegance and effortless luxury, though I knew how much effort, money, and behind-the-scenes scrambling had gone into creating that illusion of ease. Servers moved like shadows between guests, the DJ was doing sound checks, and the florist was having a mild meltdown over a centerpiece that wasn't symmetrical. Emily was in the bridal suite, surrounded by her bridesmaids and a makeup team, while our mother flitted around the lobby in a designer gown she'd never be able to afford without my help last year during her credit card fiasco. I walked through the crowd, nodding where appropriate, receiving polite compliments from people who didn't know my name but were vaguely aware I was the sister, and when someone complimented my uniform and asked if I had just returned from basic training, I smiled without correcting them. What would be the point? These people weren't here to learn who I was. They were here to applaud who Emily had become. The ceremony passed like a dream I didn't belong in. The vows were personal, the music emotional, and every line designed to elicit tears from the crowd, which it did, because Emily knew how to perform vulnerability just well enough to convince people she was genuine. I stood near the back, my hands behind my back, my posture perfect, watching her promise to love and cherish the man she had met just 2 years ago, a man who, to his credit, always treated me with a quiet kind of respect and seemed more grounded than most of her past choices. But I couldn't stop thinking about what was coming next, the reception, the toasts, the long parade of curated gratitude, and how, once again, my name wouldn't be called, my face wouldn't be acknowledged, and my contribution wouldn't even be whispered. Not because they didn't know, but because it was easier that way. Easier to pretend the dream was self-made. Easier to pretend there wasn't a ledger somewhere, with line after line of every bill I'd paid, every cost I'd absorbed, every dream of mine I'd shelved so hers could take center stage. At the reception, I was placed at the same table as the night before, close enough to see the stage, but far enough that I was clearly not meant to be part of the performance. The room filled with laughter, camera flashes, and the kind of light clinking of crystal and cutlery that always feels a little too choreographed for real life. The DJ, a tall man with a headset mic and the kind of smile that suggests he once auditioned for a reality show, took the microphone and called for the first toast. The best man stood, delivering a series of jokes that landed awkwardly but were met with polite applause. Next came the maid of honor, who began with a shaky voice and cried halfway through, causing a collective to ripple across the room like a planned reaction. And then the DJ said, "Any final toasts before we move on to the first dance?" That was my moment. I didn't move at first. I let the silence settle. I watched Emily glance my way with a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, not quite, but a recognition. She knew. Somewhere inside that perfectly sculpted exterior, she knew I wasn't going to stay seated. Not this time. Her smile faltered for just a second. A second was enough. I stood up slowly, the chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, and every eye turned toward me. The microphone was just a few feet from where she sat, and I walked toward it with the kind of calm that only comes after months, no, years of holding everything in. I didn't rush. I didn't shake. I didn't look at her. Not yet. I took the mic in one hand, adjusted it slightly, and let the quiet stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then I said, with absolute clarity, "I thought you'd want to thank the person who paid for it all." And the room went dead silent. The air snapped tight like a wire. The laughter stopped mid-breath. Forks hovered above plates. All eyes were now either on me or darting nervously toward the bride, waiting to see if this was a joke, a bit, some kind of rehearsed surprise. But it wasn't. I saw my mother's face pale slightly. I saw the groom's expression shift from confusion to realization. I saw Emily, who had always prided herself on composure, grip the edge of the table with fingers that had stopped pretending. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I lowered the mic back onto the stand and looked straight at my sister, not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with something colder, more final, more honest. She looked back at me, her mouth slightly parted, 1,000 words trapped behind the years she had chosen not to speak them. I turned, walked back toward my seat, and for the first time in years, I felt tall. Because sometimes you don't need to scream or explain or fight to be heard. Sometimes all you have to do is tell the truth. For a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, no one moved, no one breathed, and no one seemed willing to acknowledge what had just happened out loud. The silence hung heavy over the room like dust after a collapsed ceiling, still, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. Each second dragging into the next with a kind of suspended disbelief that rarely shows up in real life unless something has gone irrevocably wrong. Or right. It's hard to say, even now. What I do know is that when I put that microphone back into its cradle and returned to my seat, I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel like I had won anything. Whatever that might have meant in a family like mine where winning had always meant remaining quiet the longest. What I felt was a release, a slow exhale that had been trapped inside my chest for what might have been years, maybe decades. The DJ, bless his heart, had absolutely no idea what to do next. He stood frozen near the soundboard with a fixed smile that flickered like a dying bulb, scanning the crowd as if looking for someone to cue him, to tell him this was part of the script. That it was all just a dramatic bit before the music kicked back in and everyone laughed. But no one laughed. No one clapped. No one moved, not even Emily, who now sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable, her posture too rigid to pass as relaxed, but too restrained to look outwardly shaken. My mother, seated 3 tables away in a champagne-colored gown that shimmered under the overhead lights, looked like she might speak, and then thought better of it. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, her fingers tightening around the base of her wine glass. A few guests glanced at each other, the kind of glances that ask silent questions, "Is that true? Did she just say what I think she said? Should we pretend we didn't hear it?" But no one had the courage to vocalize anything. Because the truth, even when it's delivered gently, hits harder than any slap when it's been hidden for too long. It wasn't rage that made me do it. It wasn't revenge in the typical sense. I hadn't come to that wedding planning to ruin it or to throw a grenade into my sister's big day. The truth is, I had waited until the very last possible moment, giving her every chance to say my name, to nod toward me, to offer even the smallest sliver of acknowledgement in a day filled with curated beauty and perfectly worded sentiments. But when none came, when my presence had been reduced to a seat at the back and a forced smile, I realized the only thing left to do was hold up a mirror and let her see what she had created. Or what she had erased. The music eventually returned, too loud and too cheerful to match the mood, and the wedding timeline proceeded with brittle awkwardness, guests trying to reassemble themselves, to pick up the dropped rhythm and pretend that nothing uncomfortable had just rippled through the carefully planned sequence of toasts, dances, and polite small talk. But it was there, beneath every exchanged glance and every nervous sip of champagne, a crack running down the center of the event, sharp and permanent. I stayed seated for most of it, not out of spite, but because I was tired in a way that went deeper than the body, tired in the soul. I had shown up. I had done more than that. I had built the stage she was standing on, and when I had finally asked, wordlessly, to be seen, I was told to be quiet. So now I let myself be quiet, but on my terms. When dinner ended and the crowd began migrating toward the dance floor, I stood slowly, walked toward the head table where the bride and groom were now seated in stiff silence, and pulled a small envelope from the inside pocket of my uniform. It wasn't large or dramatic or wrapped in silk. It was a plain white envelope with 2 items inside, a personal check made out for the exact amount of their honeymoon package and a handwritten note that said, "Consider this my final contribution. I hope you find what you're looking for." I didn't say a word as I set it down gently in front of them. The groom looked up at me first. His expression was strange, not angry, not confused, but somehow relieved. I think, on some level, he had always known the version of Emily he was marrying wasn't the full truth, and now he was seeing that truth unfold in real time. He gave a small nod. That was it. No words. But it was more than she had given me. Emily looked at the envelope, then at me, her face unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might finally say something, offer a kind of peace, even a fractured one. But instead, she whispered so only I could hear, her voice laced with a bitterness that sounded like years of resentment condensed into a single breath. "You always think you're the hero. You're not. You're just bitter I made a life without you." I wanted to laugh, but the ache in my chest stopped me. Not because I believed her, but because I had once believed in her. That's what hurt more than anything else. Not the ingratitude, not the lies, not the public erasure, but the realization that the sister I had protected, defended, and carried for so long had never really seen me as anything but a tool to be used, a resource to be mined, and a shadow to keep behind her light. I walked away without looking back. In the parking lot, the air felt cooler, sharper, like the kind of air that follows a storm and carries the scent of something new, maybe not better, but clearer. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the wind tug gently at the ribbons tied to the fence posts outside the venue, and then my phone buzzed. One new message. From the groom. It read, "I didn't know. You deserved better. Thank you for everything." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. No victory to claim. No dramatic final monologue. Just the quiet, steady truth that I had told, and the space it left behind, a space that was mine now, free of apologies, free of performance, free of the need to be understood by people who never tried. And as I turned the key in the ignition and pulled onto the dark road ahead, I realized something I should have known long ago. Sometimes, the loudest form of closure is not the confrontation, not the explosion. Not even the carefully chosen words spoken into a microphone. It's the act of walking away without asking anyone to follow. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can leave behind isn't a scar or a speech. It's your absence. And the silence that finally lets the truth echo.